Joining us now is the president and founder of Encima Global, David Malpass. He was the chief economist at Bear Stearns, also served as deputy assistant treasury secretary under President Reagan. President Reagan and President Bush 1.
Bush 41, I was at the State Department. Hi, Matt.
Nice to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today. Let me ask you first off about today's reports. You say that today's reports show us that quantitative easing is unnecessary. And yet I read a quote from another economist today, John Herman, who says today's reports are all consistent with Bernanke's message. The consumer and the economy are still in need of support as private job creation is insufficient to cause a material improvement in the unemployment rate and in consumer confidence. So,
well, there you go. That's economics, one side and the other. What I saw in the reports this morning was pretty strong retail sales and upward revisions to August. So it looks to me like the soft patch that we had in the spring, it pretty much came to the end. It wound down at the end of the summer. And so the Fed's off its timing in talking about the monetary stimulus now. They might have done that in March, last March, when Greece was having trouble, when the oil spill occurred in the Gulf. That was in maybe late April or early May, and that really hit people's consumption. But we don't need it now, and it looks to me like it's clearly having a harm on the dollar. It's kind of ironic that we're having the China report, that the question of whether they're manipulating their currency, when the most obvious currency manipulator in the world is the United States.
Although Japan has to be at least a close second.
No, they have low interest rates and their currency is going up. We are clearly working on a weak dollar policy, and so the manipulation is on the U.S. side, pushing the dollar down. George Bush was manipulating the dollar down massively with the Fed. Bush 2. Bush 43 was doing that, and now Obama is continuing the Bush policy of pushing the dollar down.
Let me ask you on that note, Ed Yardeni came on yesterday, talked with me and Carol, and said that he agrees with you that the soft patch appears to be over. We're getting better data at the end of the summer and into the winter here, and he thinks that quantitative easing at this point, embarking on that, would be very dangerous. Do you agree?
I don't think it's so much a danger in that the Fed's not really doing very much. They borrow money from banks and they put it into treasuries, and it looks like it'll be relatively short-term treasuries. So as a thought experiment, pretend they were buying just T-bills. It would have no effect at all because they're paying interest to the commercial banks and they're owning these treasuries. So it's only to the extent that they have some maturity in their portfolio that it's manipulating down the yield curve. And so to me, it's not so much dangerous, other than it clearly shows that the Fed doesn't care about the dollar.
Let me just ask you, you and I have been talking about this for years. What is the danger to the economy, to the American sort of civilization of a weak dollar policy? I mean, it does boost our manufacturing,
I don't think so. No. Because remember, the huge impact it has been having is to drive capital out of the U.S. So there's simply not enough risk capital in the U.S. to be inventing new export products. So we saw a clear example of this with Japan in the 1980s, where they weakened the yen under massive U.S. pressure in the middle of the 80s, and all the capital in the world moved. They strengthened the yen, and so the dollar was weakening, and the capital moved to Japan, and they invented huge new products that became their export base in the 1990s. That's happening now. China is getting all the capital, and so they create exports and export jobs, and it shows up in the data on per capita income. The U.S. has had a lost decade. I think a huge percentage of that is because of the weak dollar policy. As the dollar weakened in 2004, 5, 6, and 7, the money in the U.S. and the big corporate money went abroad and created exports for other countries, not for the U.S.
What do you think the result is going to be this time? I mean, you don't see it turning around, right? This administration, this Fed is going to continue weakening the dollar.
Well, yeah, and we've seen other developing countries that used to be industrialized countries. So Argentina used to be a strong, big country, and then they began a currency weakening program and became a developing country and then a poor developing country. So we can go on with this as long as poor as we want to get, we can continue it that way. Look what's happening to the relative per capita income around the world. The U.S. is going strongly backward under these policies. And now we're going to add to it with a tax increase.
All right, and David, you put out a very interesting note yesterday. You're the first economist I've seen who thinks that we will now not see an extension in any way of the Bush tax cuts.
You know, I was on the staff of the Senate Budget Committee and did the tax cut in 1986, and then I was at Treasury and did it from the administration side. And one thing I learned in those years is how powerful the procedures are in Congress, and they're heavily biased toward keeping tax rates up. If you cut tax rates, they don't give you any credit for it being stimulative for growth. And so as Congress faces this tax increase in the lame duck session, it's procedurally going to be very, very hard to get the 60 votes needed to have a, quote, tax cut, meaning to stop the tax increase that's coming at us.
So if they, effectively raise taxes, and it would be across the board, right, for low income, for middle income workers as well, people's paychecks would essentially be smaller starting in January, and it's obviously broad, so it's going to hit income taxes, dividends, capital gains, estate taxes. What does that do to the markets? I mean, you say it hasn't been priced in yet. So what do we see on the S&P, for example?
We saw the flip side in 2003. When those tax cuts were put in place, there was a gigantic rally in the S&P, because when you lower the cost of capital, meaning the dividend and capital gains rates and the income taxes on the high end, you get more of it, and so you get higher priced equities. So I think it's a negative for equities that's not yet priced in. People are right now counting on them to straighten it out in the lame duck session, or they say, well, they'll just do it in January. Procedurally, that's very, very hard to do, and I think it's unlikely.
All right. Hey, David, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Really appreciate it. David Malpass from Encima Global.